Hello, my name is Dr. Mitchell Culver, and this is an Analytics to Action webinar series that's being sponsored by the Center for Student Analytics here at Utah State University, New America, and also the EDUCAUSE Student Success Analytics Community Group. I'm really delighted to be with you for the second session of the webinar, and I wanted to alert you to the one last webinar in the series, which will be happening on March 13th. And a link for that and a calendar invite will go out in the coming days. This webinar is being recorded, so this will be made available via YouTube, and the link will be sent out to all the attendees and everyone who requested the link who was unable to attend. I'm really pleased to be with you. I'd like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Mitchell Culver. I'm the founding manager of what's called the Center for Student Analytics here at Utah State. And the center is a professional and organizational development entity. So we work in the medium of analytics towards the goal of enhancing professional empowerment and data literacy amongst our professionals so that we can optimize the university. And this webinar series is about empowering ethical use of analytics in higher education. This is a really important issue, and there's lots of different angles to examine this from. Today, we're going to be talking about the strengths and limitations of predictive analytics. So we're going to get started, and for those of you who may not have audio, you need to do an audio check locally. We've checked the sound with many of the participants, and they're able to hear us. So check local audio settings. I guess I better type this in. So we're going to get started, and as I said, today's webinar is grounded in the strengths and limitations of predictive analytics. Predictive analytics are a really exciting opportunity that we have in the world of higher education, and they differ so dramatically from what has come before, which we would say would be descriptive statistics that basically describe very concretely what has happened. Predictive analytics are so different from that we want to talk about the ethical limitations of those predictive systems and how professionals can actually engage with them in a way that empowers them to take really meaningful, effective action. And so I want to start by talking about analytics as a tool, this idea that if we can think of analytics as nothing more sophisticated than a hammer, it helps us to start to conceptualize how analytics can be wielded by a professional. This is an important thing to understand because we would never expect a hammer to build a house. The hammer is necessary as part of the process of building the house, but in itself it's not sufficient. Tools are powerful in the hands of well-trained professionals, and so this phrase, necessary but not sufficient, is an important element of socializing analytic systems because that reality that you actually have to treat the analytics as separate from the professional and subservient to the professional is a really important aspect of empowering these systems ethically. So, but in the 21st century, we also have to think of the professional as necessary but not sufficient. In the 21st century, well-trained professionals need additional resources to be effective. And you'll read about these things in the Chronicle of Higher Ed, how there's many different universities who have found effective ways to deploy analytics systems. And they are investing in people and tools, and the two combined actually is what becomes necessary and sufficient. In the 21st century, a well-trained professional with the right tools is a potent force for good. And so you have to envision this idea that there is a dynamic and important interconnection between professional operation and the tools themselves, and one without the other is not going to be sufficient for getting the kind of results that we want to see here in higher education. So this was articulated in October in an EDUCAUSE webinar called The Life Cycle of Sustainable Analytics. And this is that life cycle, and it pieces out the framework of analytics into two equal halves. The first is what we would think of as formal analytics, where we have data collection, data science, visualization. And then the second half, where we talk about socialization of tools, empowerment of human action, and advocacy and innovation. And both parts are equal and emphasize the importance and the necessity of both the professional and the tools, but also emphasizes that neither one by themselves is sufficient. You really need both halves of this life cycle. Now, we don't have time to go into this life cycle in depth, so I want to point you at a white paper that is a companion to that October webinar, which you can download at this link here, ais.usu.edu/analytics/webinar. And that companion white paper really walks through this idea that both professionals and tools are required in order to achieve the kind of gains that we want to see and optimization of the higher education space. And so if you'll visit that and download that white paper, that unpacks those concepts even more. Today, we are going to be focusing a great deal on the combination of tools and people and how these super advanced complex prediction models can help professionals actually do a better job. And so as we get into this, I just want you to keep coming back to this idea that the hammer is subservient to the professional. And we'd never want to confuse it the other way around and think that the professional was somehow a slave or responsible to the hammer. And the other thing that I want to talk about is how in the 21st century, these tools, it's actually a little bit more powerful than a hammer. Analytics are more like a nail gun, right? That because predictive models are so much more potent at identifying when students are at risk for not persisting towards graduation, at identifying students who may not be on track to get a positive course outcome, that it's not just a hammer. It actually is this pneumatic air-powered nail gun, and you can do a lot of damage with that because we're not dealing with descriptive statistics anymore, which is kind of a reflective look at what has already happened. Predictive analytics is actually looking into the future, giving us a glimpse into a possible future. And because it's not certainty, it's only probable, we actually are dealing with more like a nail gun. And of course, if you point this in the wrong direction, you can hurt yourself, but more likely you could hurt someone else. And we do know that predictions, if wielded ineffectively, actually do harm students. There was a really good, I don't know that this was widely publicized, but there was a really good example of where students were being shown their predictions. You're red. You're extraordinarily likely not to persist at this university. And retention actually went down amongst those students because the students were saying, well, if you think I'm red and I knew I was red to begin with, and the computer knows I'm red, then I might as well just not be here anymore. And so rather than spurring students to take the recommended actions, the students were actually fulfilling that prophecy and saying, oh no, I'm not gonna be successful. You know it, I know it. Let's just call it what it is. And of course, we want to avoid that. And so where you aim these tools is an ethical consideration, and how you estimate the predictions themselves is also extraordinarily important to understand that a professional cannot be well trained in use of predictive analytics unless they understand the strengths and limitations of those predictions. So I want to talk about that a little bit. This is a really popular example of when a prediction went in a direction that was against the model. So who was going to win the presidency in 2016? 538, Nate Silver at 538 had made this prediction that there was a 71.4% chance that Hillary Clinton was going to win, and a 28.6% chance that Donald Trump was going to win. This was the night before the election. That's how the probability shook out. And the next day, of course, what happened was that the results were announced and Trump had won the election. And so it's funny because Twitter erupted and said, oh, Nate Silver was wrong. 538 got it wrong. They were wrong, they were wrong, they were wrong. But what I want you to do is answer this multiple choice question. So here was the prediction the night before the election. Donald Trump won the election. This means that the 538 prediction was A, correct, B, incorrect, C, accurate, D, inaccurate, and E, not enough information to determine the answer. And then, of course, we don't want just a guess here. We actually want the answer and an explanation of the answer. Okay? So in this case, what I want to say is that the interesting thing on Twitter is that there was well-educated professionals, members of political class, members of the press, who were saying, oh, Nate Silver got it wrong. Isn't that funny? Nate Silver, 538, they were wrong, they were wrong, they were wrong. How terrible, how embarrassing. And of course, Nate Silver was sitting there going, what do you mean wrong? I said there was a 28% chance that Donald Trump could win. I didn't say there was a 0% chance that Donald Trump was going to win. I said there was a 28%, which is better than 1 in 4. And this started to reveal, this is a really good example that reveals that even well-trained professionals operating in the space of politics misunderstand predictions. They think that 71.4% means a certain victory for Clinton. Because anything over 50% in a binary outcome means 100%. And this is a common issue. The correct answer to this question here, A, B, C, D, and E, is actually E. There's not enough information on this slide to determine whether or not Nate Silver's prediction model was accurate. In the first place, an important thing to understand is we don't determine models as being correct or incorrect. Predictions are not correct or incorrect. What we do is we say, is the model accurate or inaccurate? And so C and D were actually the only two possible answers. But in order to know model accuracy, you don't base accuracy of a model on a single outcome, on one outcome. You actually determine model's accuracy by looking at a whole bunch of outcomes and figuring out how would this model perform in the long run, right? And so model accuracy is determined by a lot of different statistics, what we call fitness statistics, that help us to know if the model is moving in the right direction. And Nate Silver was using a very accurate prediction model, and it just happened to go against common conventions that, in fact, Donald Trump won, which was what the prediction was. In order to know what, whether or not a model is accurate, we use what's called receiving operating characteristics. And these are pretty intense to understand. It requires understanding at least a part of calculus and of normal distributions. And it's basically a way to graph the number of false positives that a prediction model produces in relationship with the number of true positives that a prediction model produces. Since I don't want to teach calculus in this webinar, what I want to do is just compare it to a car alarm in a parking lot, a grocery store parking lot. Basically, the idea here is your car alarm has a certain sensitivity rate. And that sensitivity rate basically says when there's a certain amount of force being applied to the car, you need to go off. And of course, what that means is that if a burglar is trying to get into your BMW, then the alarm will go off most of the time. But it also means that if there's a stray shopping cart that's running past and hits your car, if your alarm is appropriately sensitive, it's going to pick up that false positive and go off even though it's just a shopping cart. And maybe you've experienced that. The idea here is that sensitivity, as you increase sensitivity, you increase both the risk of true positives, which means catching the burglar, and also the risk of false positives, which means catching the stray shopping cart. And so you can't increase a model's sensitivity without increasing both of those. And the idea of a receiver operating characteristics curve, or what we call a ROC curve, a ROC curve, is basically to find the sweet spot, where in this top corner here along this blue line, where you're maximizing the number of true positives over the number of false positives that you're getting. And so one of the things that this reveals about prediction models is that prediction models are built, they are built with the understanding that there will be false positives. And that what the model optimization is about is to say, we're going to maximize the number of true positives and minimize the number of false positives, but there will still be false positives. We cannot get away from that. And in order for people to understand predictions, they have to understand that all prediction models come with false positives, and that is an essential aspect of the game. And so unless a person can understand that, they're not going to be able to estimate the accuracy of a model. They're not going to be able to deal with the false positives. So we talked about this in terms of a presidential election. We train models like this based on historical data, right? So in this model that was used by Nate Silver as a really good example of an accurate prediction that just happened to go a different way than what was expected. The thing that you can do with this is you can't determine the model's accuracy with a single outcome, but you can apply that model across many different elections, presidential elections, and you can look at how that model's characteristics stack up in predicting whether or not Clinton won, whether or not George Bush won. And the thing is about that is that we have those data, we have those known outcomes and the data that led up to them. And so you can test a model using historical data. Well, we do the same thing with students, right? Students, we're making a prediction for our existing students. All of our predictions for existing students are made based on previous student data. So we look at previous student data and common patterns of experience and how those common patterns of experience meaningfully and systematically co-vary with the outcomes we care about, whether it be graduation rates, persistence rates, course performance. And as we have a wealth of that data in our systems, we can take existing students and say, for this existing student and their data, does their data match a common pattern of experiences that we've seen in previous student data, where we can basically start to make a prediction? And so I want to ask the same question here. If a student had the exact same odds of, for example, persisting at the institution, a 71.4% chance of persisting at the institution and a 28.6% chance of leaving, and then the student leaves. So this is this exact same question, right? The student leaves the university. This means the prediction was, and you have to answer the same question. Was the prediction correct, incorrect, accurate, inaccurate? Not enough information to determine the answer. Of course, the E is the exact same answer as last time. It's E. The accuracy of the model is determined over many predictions, not just a single prediction. We don't use a single prediction to determine a model's accuracy. And that accuracy is determined using fitness statistics, like receiver operating characteristics and so forth. And so the tendency is for people who use these systems, for example, academic advisors, who may get this prediction for this student who has a high likelihood of persisting at the institution. And they may falsely misinterpret, and say, well, if they have a 71.4% chance, then they're golden. I don't have to worry about them. And miss the opportunity to say, oh, but they also have a 28.6% chance of leaving. And so just because they're on the the good end of the spectrum, doesn't mean that they're free and clear. And so in this case, we determine model accuracy through fitness statistics, which aren't listed on the page here. And we do that using all existing available data. At Utah State, we use Banner, which is our student information system. We use Canvas, which is our LMS. And we also use card swipes. And we use that for our current students, but also historically. We use the model of all of that historical student data to find common patterns of experience that meaningfully and systematically co-vary with the student outcomes. And we compare existing student data to that information in order to make these predictions. And it's very important to understand that these predictions are easy to misinterpret, and without proper training, that's what we have found has gone on. So I want to give you some examples of that. So here's an example, two real examples from an advisor who I don't think had gotten the full training. By the way, many of the slides that I'm showing you, the presidential election slides and the tools and people slides, these are the slides that we use to train our professionals on how to use predictive models. So this training that you're getting now, this webinar that you're experiencing now, is very akin to the training that you might experience if you were an academic advisor here at Utah State University. However, for that audience, we would actually be using a lot more examples that were custom just to those academic advisors and slides that were referent to their experiences as advisors. Some of that you'll see as we continue. So I want to give you some examples of how an advisor very understandably misinterpreted the predictive model and what its capabilities were. So this is an actual quote from an advisor email that was sent to me. One student seemed like a very strong student. The model said his likelihood to persist was very high. So when he missed his second meeting with me, I assumed he was just busy. It wasn't until the end of the semester, with the prediction still showing high likelihood to persist, that I realized he had dropped all but one class. Had the prediction model shown a change when he dropped his courses, I would have looked deeper into it, contacted the student early on, and possibly helped him overcome any issue he was facing. And what the advisor's complaint here is an understandable complaint saying that in this case, you missed a true positive. This student was at risk and you missed him. And I don't like that that happened. And I'm going to send you an email about it. Well, remember in that receiver operating characteristics, you can catch students like that, but you have to turn up your true positive sensitivity way farther than is wise, right? Because as you turn up your true positive sensitivity on this blue line, as you're moving north, right, in this plane, you're also moving the false positive rate up as well, right? So as we move up on the true positive, we're actually moving along the false positive. And so that blue line, we want to be more towards that upper left corner. And so we can't be perfectly sensitive to every burglar, so to speak. In this case, student who's gonna leave the institution, right? In this case, this advisor said, your model should have been more sensitive. And our response is, essentially, that's true. We do want sensitivity too, but we don't want sensitivity so sensitive that it's going off with every shopping cart that happens to meander by. We have a question in the chat box from Christy Davis. Your slide with banner, canvas, card swipe indicated that you were using financial aid data in your predictions. Is that the case? And that is true. So just to clarify, the question is a good question. It's a sharp question because there are laws that actually govern financial aid data differently than almost any other student data that a university operates with. And specifically, those laws are the Higher Ed Act, Title IV of the Higher Ed Act, and then also some guidelines that are released by the Department of Education's PTAC unit, PTAC. And then there's also some NIST standards that kind of help clarify. NIST standard 800-171 is one of those standards. And what you have to understand is that to ingest financial aid data into a prediction system under Title IV, you have to be using that data to either administer financial aid or audit and program evaluate financial aid. And in our case, the financial aid data that we are including is being used not by the campus community, but by financial aid administrators in their work of administering financial aid and evaluating the administration of financial aid. And the Title IV of the Higher Ed Act says, and some guidance from PTAC at the Department of Ed, PTAC, has said very clearly that those use cases are acceptable. We don't want to include financial aid data so that some advisor can look at the student's financial aid data. We don't want to include financial aid data so that some faculty member can look at the financial aid data. If you're including financial aid data in a model, you're including it so that it can be used by financial aid administrators for the purpose of awarding those funds and evaluating the awarding of those funds. And that's actually why it's in there. It's a really sharp question because that's an important ethical issue to understand. Thanks, Christy, for that question. Hopefully that addresses your question. So I want to get to this example and say we have to understand that there are definitely going to be cases where we miss a true positive, and we forego that. In this case, also, the advisor is exercising hindsight bias, and we're careful to train our professionals about this. We don't want to get to the end and see the actual result and say, see this actual result, the model should have known that. Because by then, we already know what the outcome was. And the truth is that the reason why the model kept this student's prediction high is because many students in similar circumstances are likely to enroll again. And that's what the historical data had told the prediction model. It had said there's lots of students who drop all but one class and then continue to persist at the institution the following semester. So we're not going to lower this student's prediction rate because our historical data says not to. The advisor is saying, with hindsight bias, saying, well, this student left the institution, your system should have known. And the issue there is the advisor saying, based on my anecdotal experiences, your system should be tooled differently. And we don't use advisor anecdotal experiences. We use very complex, systematic ways of determining what data is capable of telling us, and we tether the model to that data, and we stick within those guide rails. So it's an important example to work through because you can understand the advisor's frustration, but there is a limitation to these models. They will not catch every burglar without catching every shopping cart that even touches the car. And so we can't turn sensitivity all the way up because then you'd be calling every student and saying, oh, I want to talk to you. Can you come in? And we want to keep the models optimized for appropriate sensitivity. Here's another example. Advisor emails about a student and says he is failing every class, is on academic semester warning, and last I checked, the prediction model had actually recently increased the probability that he would persist. It's sitting at 80% for this student. We then went and dropped some of his classes and made plans for him to be successful in all of his remaining classes. Had we not had an early alert tip-off from a faculty member, there would have been no reason for me to look him up and check his grades. He would have failed everything, lost his financial aid, and probably not returned. And then the advisor says, there's enough of this kind of discrepancy that I tend to not want to even look at the predictions because I'm afraid of being told inaccurate things. And here's this word inaccurate again. And I want to remind you that the issue here is one of does a professional understand that prediction models come with inaccuracies, both true positives and false positives, but also missed true positives, right? And missed true negatives, right? And in this case, there is discrepancy. That's the issue here, is that in order to use a predictive model, one must accept that there is discrepancy and not rebuff and bristle and say, there's discrepancy, I cannot bear this. Partly the issue here is the standard that the advisor using, it misreads the 80%, right? So for every 5 students that are rated an 80% likelihood to persist at the institution, 1 will leave the institution. I think that in this case, we have a student who's that one student who left, right? But they caught him beforehand. And anyway, he is persisting, so the model actually was pretty accurate. But the idea here is that when it says 80%, it's not 100%. It's 80%, which means over 5 students, 4 will stay, 1 will leave. And we need to be allowing for that kind of discrepancy where students who have a high likelihood of sticking around are in fact going to depart from the institution. And there are things we maybe can do to prevent that, and there's things that we can attempt, but ultimately these prediction models are not so accurate that will catch every single student that's going to leave. Because I want to remind you, it's not a crystal ball. If the models were performing as well as this advisor would like, we could quit our jobs and go to Vegas. You could come too. We'd make a killing because the prediction model would be so good we could predict every horse race, every football game, everything. Because all these models work when you're applying to predicting almost anything, whether it's a horse race or a football game or students leaving the institution. And they're not so fine-tuned that you would take them to Vegas. And so partly what I'm saying here is that to use a predictive model, one must accept discrepancy. And unless you're going to be willing to accept those discrepancies, then of course you're going to be frustrated. And so part of what I'm talking about here is tuning expectations early. And this is why that life cycle of sustainable analytics has 2 equal halves. It's not sufficient to turn on an analytics system and provide the tool and say it's a really great model, you should use this. You have to pair that with socialization and empowerment of human action with appropriately tuned expectations for how the tool functions and where its limitations are and where its strengths are. And I think that the models that we're building are very effective, and we do catch a lot of students. And we have data to show that advisor activity in these analytic systems actually is associated with a dramatic increase in student persistence at our institution in recent semesters. And we're not surprised because we hear these wonderful stories of actually advisors catching students right in the right moment. So we're not going to go to Vegas, which means how do we give predictions their appropriate space? How do we understand these tools are powerful but also have limitations? Where is that line and where is that space that we can operate in? So I want to show you this model that Charles Thornburg had shared last year at ASU plus GSV in, I think it was in San Diego. Basically, he talks about systems of record, systems of engagement, and in a minute here you're going to see a third system called systems of intelligence. Before we get to systems of intelligence, though, we have to remind ourselves where we've come from. The history of, for example, this is an academic advisor sitting at their desk, is that the advisor historically has been the system of intelligence. So they sit in front of systems of records, for example, transcripts, student grades, different early alert systems from a faculty member, systems of record that help them to make decisions about the student's well-being. And they use their professional judgment and experience to kind of craft a personal prediction model of how a student's going to do. And they also use systems of engagement. So they look at the way the student's emailing, how responsive the student is, interactions, appointments with the student, which would be an engagement with a student, an actual in-person meeting. And they start to build a personal prediction model in their mind of where they think the student is headed and what resources might help the student stay on the right path. And so what I'm trying to tell you is that before analytics have been released into the waters of higher education, we already had prediction systems in place. They were called, for example, in this case, an academic advisor. The brain is actually really good at modeling regression. We're really good at predicting things. And we use variables that are available to us. We weigh them, just like a regression does, a logistic regression, for example. We weigh them, and then we make a prediction. So you may be sitting with a student, and all of your historical experience with their records, with their engagement instances, and with everything that you've done in your historical experience with students, you may say, you know, this student feels like they're in the same situation as other students I've seen who ultimately were not successful. And so that gives me the inclination that there's a certain % chance that this student may be on the same path. Now, that's not a certitude, but advisors have heretofore been the prediction system, right? Have been the system of intelligence. But in the 21st century, we now have the ability to put advisors in front of systems of intelligence in these predictive analytics systems. And now there is shared ownership of making predictions. And this makes advisors uncomfortable, and you can understand why. It makes professionals uncomfortable. We partner with Civitas Learning to do some of this modeling, a lot of this modeling, and they use a 5-color system of prediction, and they kind of use these buckets to put students in. So the system of intelligence that we're giving to advisors has these 5 different buckets, and they sit in front of those systems, and now they have existential crisis, right? Because now they're used to dealing with systems of record and systems of engagement, but now we've put in front of them a system of intelligence that mimics what they heretofore had been accomplishing using their own brain. And some of their reactions are, for example, can I trust a computer? One thing I can say about whether or not you can trust a computer is that one thing a computer can do that an advisor cannot do is that a computer, an analytics model, can constantly scan all student records and all engagement data and build predictions for all 23,000 of our students all the time. An advisor can sit in front of one record at a time and in front of one system of engagement at a time and make predictions for one student at a time. And so can you trust a computer? I think the answer here is if you understand what the computer is doing, is that the computer is sifting through all records and making predictions for all students, then you start to say, oh, well, that's useful, actually. Because if that computer can flag me when I may need to pay a little bit closer attention to a student, then that saves me time if I'm willing to trust the computer. The other thing that I think is pretty legitimate is this: professionals will say, is this computer going to replace me? And I'm a strong advocate for saying no to that. I've seen the Skynet Terminator movies. I know where this is headed if we try to replace humans with computers. But I think it's more important than that. I think it's important to understand that there are things that humans will always be able to do that computers will not be capable of doing. And a lot of that has to do with human connection, right? So that if we remember that we've hired, for example, academic advisors to be entities of human connection, and that they're remarkable at that, and in fact that's what makes the difference in student lives, then we can actually start to remind ourselves that the computer is secondary, just like the tool, the hammer, is wielded by the hand of the professional and is subservient to the professional. So too, systems of intelligence should always remain subservient to the professional, and we should always value above those systems the advisor's professional judgment and experience. And I think that that's an ethical aspect to this work, is not turning our judgment over to the system and just saying, well, the system's turned on, so I don't have to exercise any judgment anymore. But actually, we need a balance between those things. The other thing that advisors will say, as you've seen, is why are some of these predictions wrong? And as I've talked about, we need to tune advisors' expectations that discrepancies exist in the system because it's not a perfect prediction model. It's not a crystal ball. It is a prediction model that does its best at weighing true positives against false positives and trying to find the sweet spot. And so are predictions going to be kind of misleading at times and in places? Absolutely. But is that enough to throw our hands up and say, I don't want to use this? Not if we understand the possibilities. So I want to talk about the possibilities in terms of human connection. So I have these two figures here. One represents perhaps a higher ed professional, and the other a higher education student. And these two arrows are what I would say a cycle of human interaction. When we have trained professionals to use analytics, we have somehow inadvertently given them the impression that what we want them to do is stop having human interaction and replace human interaction with digital interaction. I had one professional tell me, after the training, I was convinced that you just wanted me to send more emails to students, and that was going to save them. And then it was in time, after I heard you speak about this 2 or 3 times, that I suddenly realized, oh, this whole time, what he has always wanted is for me to increase human interaction. And because that's what I believe in. I don't believe that data by itself changes students' lives. I believe that human interaction changes humans' lives. And I want to give you a few examples of this. So we had an academic advisor with 10 years of experience who trusted the systems of intelligence. In one semester, 4 weeks, 5 weeks into the semester, a good student, had turned kind of orange-red. And the advisor said, an opportunity. The system has picked up something, has been scanning records, and has picked up something that I wouldn't have picked up. I'm going to get this student to come and talk to me. So counting on the value of human interaction, the advisor called the student and said, come on in. The student came, and the advisor said, what's going on? The system says that you're not using Canvas anymore. And the student said, yeah, that's exactly right. In the last 3 weeks, my mother died from cancer. My husband was hospitalized for cancer, and I was diagnosed with cancer, all at the same time. And the advisor said, oh my goodness, how terrible, and can we talk through this? And as they talked through it, they realized that this student was going to basically drop out of college and not finish. The student was older and was saying, you know, I have to take care of my husband, so I don't have time to finish school, and so I'm just going to walk away. Well, the advisor looked at the records and realized that the student was the only credits remaining on the student's record were for her minor. And that if she would just drop her minor, now her bachelor's degree would be the only thing sitting there, and all the credits for that were complete, which the student did not understand. And so the advisor, in 5 minutes, basically said, well, friend, you're done. You have a bachelor's degree. Drop your minor, and you're a graduate, and we'll mail you your diploma. And you can walk away, not just walk away from higher ed, but walk away a graduate. And the student said, oh, you're joking. I had no idea, and how wonderful. And you think about this situation of facing your own cancer, your husband's cancer, and leaving school, and the difference between leaving school with an uncompleted degree and leaving school with a bachelor's degree, which is what happened. That's a really powerful example of the system of record. In that case was the LMS. Actually, it was a system of engagement, was the LMS, and the student's activity in that had tapered off. The system intelligence saw that taper and said, this is a student we need to see. And then the advisor actually exercised and was what made the difference. A system of intelligence could not have made the recommendation that this advisor made, and it was the human contact that made the difference. Another example is a student who, in her final semester, a well-performing student, 3.8 GPA, in her final semester as a senior, failed one course. The following semester, the advisor was working in the system of intelligence right at the start of the semester, and realized this student had failed the class but also hadn't re-enrolled to retake the class. Called the student and said, hey, I'm surprised to see that you're not retaking that class you failed last semester so you can finish your degree. And the student said, well, I don't understand. I failed out of college. And the advisor said, what are you talking about? And the student said, I failed a class that's required for my degree, so I'm done. And the advisor said, no. You can repeat a class up to 3 times. And the student said, what are you talking about? Oh yeah, you can repeat it. You should be enrolled. The classes are starting. You need to get back in that class and repeat it and put all your energy towards it so you can graduate in May. And the student said, oh, I didn't even realize. Well, but now my financial aid's run out because I was in school for 4 years and financial aid only goes for 4 years. And the advisor said, no, financial aid doesn't run out after 4 years. You can actually keep going and this will be great. And so the student re-enrolled, got financial aid, and passed the class and graduated. Had the system of intelligence not flagged the advisor and said this student is AWOL, what we would call a student who should be enrolled but for reasons unknown are not enrolled, the advisor never would have made that human connection and exercised her own professional judgment in helping resolve that student's issue. And here again, this is a really good example of how students so often lack institutional knowledge that we take for granted. It was a high-performing student in her final semester, and she still had not ever heard about the repeats policy that allowed her to repeat that class. So it's a really good example of an advisor trusting the system. And when we start to see advisors trusting the system, and they say, I'm going to trust the process, they start to say things like that advisor says, you know, this is wonderful. Analytics augment my professional ability because it does some thinking on my behalf that I then don't have to do. It does some checking of records that I don't have to do. And it sends up a flag when I need to maybe take human action, right? And it's important to note that how you take that action is everything, right? You don't call the student and you say, hey, I have an analytics system here that says you're red. Can you come see me? That's not ethics of care. And so next webinar in March, we're going to be talking about this issue of having augmented intelligence and how then do you use ethics of care when you start to act on those decisions. When we talk about augmented intelligence, in this case, it's kind of like when you trust the system of intelligence, it's kind of like a cybernetic implant without the weird implant, right? It does work for you that helps you to be a better advocate for students. And then advisors go, wow, this is great. Because I'm willing to trust the system and not get upset with these little ticky-tacky discrepancies, I can empower students to be very successful. Now, our approach to this actually was early on shaped by an example that I heard from NPR while driving home. And you can look this up. This is Harborview Medical Center in Seattle. And in 2011, they instituted an analytics prediction system regarding the disease sepsis. Disease and injury send people to the hospital all the time. And once they're there, a lot of them, unfortunately, develop this other situation, not what they came in for, called sepsis. Sepsis is hard to treat because it's hard to identify. There are no clear symptoms. There's no definite sign that a person has sepsis. There's no test for it. And so a lot of working with sepsis is kind of this professional judgment, trying to figure out, do I think they really have sepsis or not? And am I going to give them this huge course of antibiotics in order to avoid death from sepsis? An important thing to understand about sepsis is that it's a good analog for students dropping out of the institution. Sepsis doesn't have any tests. There's vague symptoms, and there's no known, like, absolutely this person has sepsis. So too with student persistence at an institution, there's no test you can run that helps you to know that a student's about to drop out. There are no clearly definable symptoms. There's just kind of constellations of symptoms. And you ultimately have to exercise your professional judgment whether or not you think they're on that line. Harborview figured out, well, but there are some common features that a computer, in this constellation of symptoms for sepsis, a computer might be able to pick that up. And if we can train the computer on historical instances of sepsis, maybe this computer can send up a flag and let us know that a person might have sepsis. And that's exactly what has been happening since 2011. When the computer sees vital signs, increased heart rate, increased fever, that are indicative of possible sepsis, it turns on a little light on the nurse's computer. And the nurses go in, and now they're the critical eyes and ears. They have to make the judgment, does this person have sepsis or not? A lot of times they'll turn the light off. They'll say, no, I don't think this person has sepsis. I think the computer was just confused, and that's okay. But in this case, the patient is going through alcohol withdrawal. And that's why their heart rate's increased and they have a fever. I don't think this is sepsis. I'm going to ignore the light. We train advisors in the same way. We say, what we'd like you to do is when the light goes on for a student, we'd like you to make human contact with them. And then through that human contact, just learn about them and interact with them as you normally would. And if you think there's something that can be done, do it. And in this case, the nurses, at Harborview, when they think that actually it might be sepsis, they start an antibiotics course early. The doctor comes in and signs off on that. And since 2011, this has reduced the instances of sepsis and has saved many lives. We found the same thing at Utah State when we have implemented these predictive analytics. When advisors trust the flags that are raised by the analytic systems, and they basically reach out to their students and say, hey, I'd like to visit with you. And can we do that? Can we have a visit just so I can learn about how your semester is going? There's opportunities where the advisor goes, I think this is sepsis, or I think this is a student who's in trouble, and now I'm going to put my best resources that the university offers towards helping the student be on the right path. And that's what we want to talk about in terms of where predictions have their appropriate place. Predictions have their appropriate place in doing some work that an advisor can't do, in scanning those records and sending up flags and letting then the advisor take over and exercise their own professional judgment through that human interaction to decide what the proper course of action is. And we've seen remarkable success with this, and we're really excited about it. Now, as a final thought, I want to go back to this idea of the professional and the tool. Both working together in the 21st century are a potent force for good, but we have to understand where the tools are powerful and where they can be powerful and where their limits are. We need to tune professionals' expectations through that kind of change management that we talked about so that they understand not to wield these tools in unethical ways. And that's partly, I want to remind you about next month's webinar where, again, I said this is the idea that how do we do that outreach? Once we've accepted that we trust the predictions, once we're willing to move forward, how do we make contact with ethics of care so that we don't harm the students by calling and saying, hey, I have an analytics system here that tells me that you're red. Why don't you come see me? Which, of course, is a risk. As a final thought before we move into questions and answers, I want to alert you to an opportunity to join the EDUCAUSE Student Success Analytics Practitioners Community Group. The goal of this community is to promote, educate, and further the network of practitioners with a desire to improve student success through the use of analytics. The more we can collaborate and share on these efforts, the easier it is for these initiatives to grow and succeed. If you're interested in joining that, there's a web page. Here's a tiny URL. So tiny.cc/SSACG, which stands for Student Success Analytics Community Group. And you can go there and you can join, and there's more information about that. And it's a really good group, and it's growing. And this is an important work that we're talking about, and so we're excited to invite people to join that. I do want to open myself up to questions and answers, which you'll need to enter into the chat box. So at this time, if you'll type your questions and answers in there, then I can respond to those. And it looks like we have 7 or 8 minutes before we probably need to wrap up. I do want to thank EDUCAUSE for getting the word out about this webinar and being a co-sponsor of this, and also New America, who's sponsoring this ethical use of analytics in higher education, Analytics to Action webinar series. So if there's any questions, we'll take those now, if you can type them into the chat box. So someone's asking, what was the community group again? They missed the webinar link, or the link to the community group. So I'm going to go back here and so that the person can catch that. tiny.cc/SSACG. We have a question from B. Croft. It says, how can we ensure predictive modeling doesn't reinscribe oppressive practices towards marginalized groups? How might we design predictive analytics in inclusive and equitable ways? And this is a beautiful question. It's an important question. And the word that I would give you is elasticity. What we have found, and what I had seen at other institutions and research that I had done elsewhere, is that when students who are at risk are given the appropriate supports, they actually exceed beyond the average expectation of students generally, or what you'd say is mainstream students, students who are not at risk. And for that reason, that elasticity where they're at risk and you give them the right support and now they excel beyond what we would expect even of mainstream students, is this idea is I would hope that we would stop using the word at risk and start using the word at promise. And what that means is that the student is at promise for intervention, that if we can get them the right supports at the right time, in a timely and early and often kind of way, that they actually can be very successful. And in fact, that's the whole point of these analytic systems, is to give us those opportunities to make good on that students who are at promise for intervention, and to stop talking about them as if they're at risk. Because I have sat with, for example, associate deans and deans who have said, oh, wonderful, you've turned on this system, it shows us who's at risk, now we can preclude them from persisting at the institution. And I say, no, hold on. You are throwing out Captain Kirk's. who will be successful against the odds if you give them the right team, right? You don't want to throw these students away. You actually just want to support them. They are at promise for extraordinary success. And the thought that you would use these prediction systems to preclude them from access to those opportunities is asinine. That is not how you use these systems. They're not designed to be used that way because the margin of error is so wide. The issue here is that if you're going to use a prediction, you should use a prediction in a way that does no harm. And we're going to talk about that next time. That's a really great question. Another question we have is, do you have accessible examples of the trainings you give to your advisors? I'm thinking, Sean, that accessible means in terms of accessibility, in terms of audio-visual support systems, so that they're captioned or so that they're accessible to, or do you mean access in terms, can you have the trainings? Why don't you email me that question and we could talk more about that, Sean. The trainings, we have some things that are available, like this webinar will be available on YouTube, for example. We have other things that we do consulting on and that we work with institutions on. A question from Juan. Faculty does not like the idea that there's a black box. How would you persuade them to accept predictive analytics? A lot of times we use what we call verbal judo. And people who want to criticize these systems, rather than trying to argue with them, I usually go and am very interested in what they're perceiving as the problem. First of all, none of these systems are a black box. All the equations that are being used, all the variables that are being used, that we use we can scope, we can talk through the data, we can talk through the modeling, we can talk through the visualization. And so usually verbal judo is when you actually invite criticism, further criticism. So someone says, hey, I got a problem with that. And you say, oh, great. Tell me more. You're my best friend now because you can tell me how to make my system better. And usually as they talk through their concerns, you realize that they're actually not really concerned. They just had questions that haven't been answered and they didn't want to ask them, and then they complain, and then you say, well, tell me more, and they ask questions, you answer the questions, and actually they start to warm up to these things. So I think that the idea that there is a black box, I think you need to be sensitive to actually being transparent about what data you're collecting, under what governance it's being collected under, how you're modeling, what models you're using, what those equations are, how those equations, fitness statistics, are showing us that those models have a high level of accuracy or that we can trust them. And then also how you're visualizing so that it actually makes sense to the people who may have these questions. So a lot of that has to do with tuning expectations. It's one of the reasons why the Center for Student Analytics that I oversee, we're not a data warehouse. We're not a data brokerage. We are a professional and organizational development entity. That's how we consider ourselves. We go out and we do the work of helping professionals increase data literacy, increase their understanding of these systems. And so it's in our interest to be transparent and actually to invite these kinds of criticisms so that we can pursue amenable solutions for all stakeholders. Jan Day says, you talked about convincing advisors to trust and work with the predictive analytics effectively. What challenges have you faced bringing faculty members into accepting use of predictive analytics? Faculty, we haven't had as much problems with faculty. We don't actually surface the student predictions to the faculty members at this point. What we do is we have a faculty-facing analytics system that helps them to, the way we use it is it helps them to write a better syllabus. It helps them to write better assignment instructions. It helps them to fine-tune their curriculum design and course structure. Faculty love that because it helps them document teaching improvement activity for the P&T process. It helps them to fill out their dossier with evidence that they're actually using data to improve their pedagogy. And so we haven't had pushback from faculty. But again, we're not actually expecting at this time faculty to use student predictions or any kind of predictive analytics. We're expecting them to use course analytics that helps them fine-tune their curriculum. We have a question, where can we find the slides? I'll include the slides with the recording as a PDF. We'll email that out later this week. John wants to know, have you done any usability studies to inform dashboard design? Yes, so we do that. We work with a company, a vendor in Austin, Texas, and a lot of our suggestions go through their product enhancement workflow. So not all of our suggestions make it, but we also design some dashboards internally here at Utah State, and with those we definitely do usability studies. And ultimately the end users are the ones who give the final approval, stamp of approval yet, that this dashboard is really going to meet my needs. Juan asks, have you included financial aid information in the predictive model? Yes, we answered that question earlier, and so I don't want to rehash it that much, but there are laws that govern the use of financial aid data, specifically the Higher Ed Act Title IV. There's NIST Standard 800-171, and then FERPA also matters too. But we have worked with Department of Ed guidelines to make sure that our inclusion of financial aid data in the model is in compliance with all state, federal laws and university policies. And then Lauren asks, do you ever use graduate students in data science to help build and test the models? I'm not, let's see, graduate students in data science. So yes, we have. So in fact, we had one graduate student who we promoted, was so good at what she was doing that we recently promoted her to a full-time staff member. She's working on her PhD and she does a really good job. So yeah, and we are always on the hunt for, currently we're looking for postdocs kind of, or graduate student interns that we're gonna hire and help us do some publications and stuff. So if that's what your question is about, Lauren, then you can certainly email me and we can talk through that. I think we're at close to the end of the time here. And so I guess we'll take just one more question and then we'll close. Juan says, faculty members are a great part of helping students succeed. Do you have a plan to include them in the future? And I think the answer to that is yes, in time. What we want to do is mature our advisors' use of analytics so that there's a strong community of practice and understanding of those predictive systems, their strengths and limitations, so that as we start to invite a much wider community, right, because we have over 2,000 faculty members, when you count all the different instructors of all the different courses, tenure track faculty, instructors, lecturers, and adjunct faculty, and graduate instructors as well, that to include that many people, you really have to have a strong community of practice first that's well established, and before you start moving out, and then you only want to move out in stages anyway. So in the future, yes, it's a great question. I want to thank everyone for attending here. My email is available there. The recording will be mailed out, and then there is the March webinar to look forward to. Thanks so much for being here, and have a good afternoon.